Phillip Lopate has been a major figure in academia and in the arts for decades, but my introduction to him only came about 5 years ago in an undergraduate workshop taught by Patrick Madden. He held up this book, this anthology, and affectionately said, "This book. We will be reading a lot from this book." And I kind of sighed, because it looked like another $80 or $90 textbook. But when I got to the bookstore, I was pleased to see that it was only about $17. And that was my first happy surprise. I'd procrastinated buying my books that semester, so when I finally did get to the library, all that was left was a handful of the used and abused copies and on that shelf, and I had to shuffle through to find the least battered one. And it's not this one, this is my second copy. My first one eventually almost fell apart. And then I flipped to the introduction, which I had already been told by Pat, this was my first assigned reading. So I'd like to read to you the very first sentence of the introduction by Phillip Lopate. This book attempts to put forward and interpret a tradition, the personal essay. Okay, I was entirely unfamiliar with the tradition, and I was only incidentally familiar with the form. I'd been writing essays since I was a kid, but I thought they didn't count as anything. So that was kind of new to me. So I admit that this idea of the attempt, I thought, this is an attempt? My professor wants me to read a 2.5-inch thick attempt. And then when I saw the introduction was a full 30 pages long, I made a plan to trudge through it in 2 or 3 sittings. But once I sat down and started reading it, I joyfully consumed the entire introduction in 1 sitting, and I wanted more. This was my second happy surprise. A short while later, I would read Lopate's essay, Reflection and Retrospection, a Pedagogic Mystery Story, and I loved it so much I sent it to everybody I knew who cared about writing, and I sent it to several people who didn't care about writing. And within a year of my first introduction to this, I was anxiously awaiting my acceptance letter to this MFA program, because I had learned that the kind of writing that I most enjoyed was, in fact, academically sanctioned. Who knew, right? I didn't dare claim to be an essayist yet, but when I grew up, I wanted to be like Phillip Lopate. Maybe less hirsute. But I wanted to be a writer like Phillip Lopate. And this was my third happy surprise. Mr. Lopate has been instrumental in making a lot of good things happen, and he's been rewarded with accolades all along the way. He played a key role in the first project of the Teachers and Writers Collaborative, coordinating workshops at Manhattan's PS 75. This project model led to similar Artists in the Schools programs in all of the 50 states. And his experience teaching creative writing to young people informed the memoir, Being with Children, for which he received a Christopher Medal. Mr. Lopate has also been the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, 2 grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, and a New York Public Library Center for Scholars and Writers Fellowship. He's also a finalist for a PEN Award for his essay collection, Portrait of My Body. And I know a few people in this room that have relied on that heavily for their theses and things. And he is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and all of that is just for starters. But we'll move on. I have grown to love the tradition of the essay. I've grown to love the form of the essay, and most of all, I love the power and the poetry of the attempt. Please join me in welcoming Phillip Lopate.
What a lovely introduction. This is my 3rd time at BYU, and I keep returning like a bad penny. And it's really my pleasure to do so. So I'm going to read a few pieces. This first is a short one called The Exercise of Doubt. I am an essayist, for better or worse. I don't suppose many young people dream of becoming essayists. Even so nerdy and bookish a child as I was used to fantasize entering the lists of fiction and poetry, those more glamorous, noble genres on which Nobels, Pulitzers, and National Book Awards are annually bestowed. So if Freud was right in saying that we can only be truly happy when our childhood ambitions are fulfilled, then I must be content to be merely content. I like the freedom that comes with lowered expectations. In the area of literary nonfiction, memoirs attract much more attention than essay collections, which are published in a modest, quasi-invisible manner in keeping with anticipated lower sales. But despite periodic warnings of the essay's demise, the stuff does continue to be published, and if anything, the essay has experienced a slight resurgence of late. I wonder if that may be because it is attuned to the current mood and speaks to the present moment. At bottom, we are deeply unsure and divided, and the essay feasts on doubt. Ever since Michel de Montaigne, the founder of the modern essay, gave as a motto, his befuddled "what do I know?" and put forth a vision of humanity as mentally wavering and inconstant, the essay has become a meadow inviting contradiction, paradox, irresolution, and self-doubt. The essay's job is to track consciousness, and if you are fully aware of your mind, you will find your thoughts doubling back, registering little peeps of ambivalence or disbelief. According to Theodore Adorno, the iron law of the essay is heresy. What else is heresy if not the expression of contrarian doubt about communal pieties or orthodox positions? This is sometimes called critical thinking, an ostensible goal of education in a democracy. But since such thinking often rocks the boat, we may find it less than supported in school settings. Typically, the exercise of doubt is something an individual has to cultivate on his or her own in private before summoning the courage to air it, say, in an essay. Recently, with fiercely increased competition for admission to the better colleges, the Common App essay has become an obsessive focus on the part of high school administrators, parents, and students. This part of the college application requires each applicant to file a personal statement, a prose reflection conveying individual sensibility, experience, or worldview. Tutors advertise on lampposts for after-school courses to prep the college aspirant for the most seductive, winning Common App. I am delighted to see this career path opening for indigent essayists. The problem is that, more often than not, the applicant is expected to put forward a confident presentation of self that is more like an advertisement, a smooth, civic-minded con job, circumventing the essayist's gift for candid, robust self-doubt. When my daughter Lily, now a college senior, was applying to colleges, she wrote what I thought was a perfect Common App essay about her mixed attraction to the idea of melancholy. Her high school counselor, while conceding it was well written, forced her to abandon it because it might give schools the wrong impression that she was a downer. Earlier, Lily, whom I had encouraged to wear her ambivalence proudly, was reproved by high school teachers for writing papers that failed to support one side of a debate, instead arguing the validity of both positions. I got it that they wanted to train her to sharpen her rhetorical ability. Argumentation is a good skill to have, but the real argument should be with oneself. Especially when it comes to the development of young writers, it is crucial to nudge them past the self-righteous inveighing, that shrill defensive one-track that is deadly for personal essays or memoirs, and encourage a more polyphonic, playful approach. That may be why a classic essay technique is to stage an inner debate by thinking against oneself. Doubt is my boon companion, the faithful Saint Bernard, ever at my side. Whether writing essays or just going about daily life, I am constantly second-guessing myself. My mind is filled with yes buts, so what, and other skeptical rejoinders. I am forever monitoring myself for traces of folly, insensitivity, arrogance, false humility, cruelty, stupidity, immaturity, and guess what? I keep finding examples. Age has not made me wiser, except maybe in retrospect. My wife sometimes complains that I will never admit I am wrong. Of course I do. Granted, less than I should, but it's not just because I am stubborn and hate to concede a point in the heat of argument. The main reason is that a part of me always assumes I'm wrong and at fault to some extent, and this is so obvious to me that it needn't bear stating. In any case, I often forget to say it aloud, but I certainly think it. Strangely enough, doubt need not impede action. If you really become friends with your doubt, you can go ahead and take risks, knowing you will be questioning yourself at every turn no matter what. It is part of living, a healthy evolutionary adaptation, I would imagine. The mistake is in trying to tune out your doubts. Accept them as a necessary or at least unavoidable soundtrack. The only danger then is starting to become smug about one's capacity for doubting, the essayist's occupational hazard to which I periodically succumb. I have found the exercise of doubt to be an enormous help in writing essays because it lets me start out with the knowledge that I may very well not achieve perfection on the page. Then I can forgive myself in advance for falling short of the mark and get on with it. My next piece is called Early Memories of a Class Traitor. 1. Dream Boy. I have never been much troubled by the inaccuracies of memory. That memory can on occasion be untrustworthy or partake of imagination, rationalization, even fiction. Big deal. I am all the more grateful for the filaments of truth that cling to it. I regard memories as akin to flashes of poetry, gifts to the psyche, similar to patches of dreams we manage to hold on to upon waking while the rest vanishes. In any case, promising fragments never to be devalued or disdained. My first conscious recollection is at 6 years old, hiding under the table while my parents had friends over, a rare event they almost never entertained at night, and thinking to myself, from this moment on, pay attention. I was in effect telling myself to wake up, and more significantly reminding myself that I had a self, was this conscious sentient being. Since I had been characterized earlier as lost in a fog, my own mother had nicknamed me Dream Boy, this command to make myself alert signified a revolutionary break with the past. Just as Henry James famously instructed would-be writers to be one on whom nothing is lost, I appeared to be telling myself precociously, henceforth keep your eyes and ears open. Of course, I had no suspicion then that I would become a writer. Most of my earliest memories proceeded instead out of a densely vague mental miasma, usually having to do with being lost. For instance, around the same age, 6, I remember being sent out to buy crumb buns in a factory around the corner on a snowy winter morning when the white precipitation had erased much of the familiar neighborhood cityscape, and I suddenly was unable to find my way back from the bakery. Where had my house gone? Again, I was sent as a monitor in first grade to a classroom one flight up, and on the staircase forgot the room number I had been dispatched to. A few years later, I was at the beach in Coney Island. When I got out of the water, I could not for the life of me find my family's blanket in the urban swarm. The thinking process each time seemed to be, I am this person, and I recognize that I must have a self because I feel lost and abandoned, which I brought on myself by stupidity, ineptitude, and failure to pay attention. It was not at all like Virginia Woolf having her first conscious moment of being, watching the curtain acorn roll on the floor. In my case, there was no such delightful image, just panic. In fact, I must admit that my dreams have generally been long on dialogue, but bereft of striking imagery, just as the poems I wrote during the period when I wrote poems were filled with poetic statement rather than images and metaphors. A defect of mine is that I am not enough of a sensualist. I do not plunge into ecstatic impressions over the smell of orchids. There is always a layer of analytical cognition getting in the way. So to return to my earliest memories, I was on the monkey bars in kindergarten. Perhaps this even predated the under-the-table memory, and suddenly I saw myself dangling between one hand grasp and the next. Who was the musketeer in that Dumas novel who suddenly became fatally conscious of the walking process while stepping away from dynamite? Was it Athos? I had discovered that I was a human being, that I had a brain, at the least convenient moment. Bam! I fell. Come to think of it, there was also the time I was leaning back on a swing so far that I tumbled off it and cracked my head. I bit my tongue so hard in the process that I still have a scar there, running crosswise. Another time I was walking home from school in my usual haze when my lower leg collided with the fin or metal rim of a car, and a beautiful bloody gash opened on my knee like a half-eaten peach, this time leaving a white half-moon scar. It's only natural that I should remember those incidents that left permanent markings on my body. Walking home from school in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, was an excellent time to sort out the public school boy from the private, dreamy self. It was a liminal space, as the academics are fond of saying. One afternoon around 3:30, when I was a few blocks away from my house, I had it very badly to go to the bathroom and made in my pants. Diarrhea ran down my leg. I climbed the stairs of our tenement house, filled with horror at what I had done, at my very smell, to the 3rd floor where we lived, where I found my mother visiting with her best friend, Gloria. Gloria was a heavy-set woman with glasses, fuzzy hair on her chin, and a quick mind, the closest one might find to an intellectual in our ghetto set, beside my bookish autodidact father. She had gone to nursing school at Columbia University. And I do remember I was threatened by the intimacy she had with my mother, the way they would both laugh knowingly about men, which I interpreted years later as having an erotic tinge. To speak bluntly, Gloria had a crush on my mother. Now they were having a good laugh at my expense as my mother took me into the bathroom to wash me off. I was abashed to stand exposed, besmirched from the waist down in front of these two women, but grateful that my mother had not gotten angry at me for losing control of my bowels. I don't remember anything like this happening in Virginia Woolf's memoirs. I do agree heartily with Woolf's insight that the problem with most memoirs is, and I quote Woolf, they leave out the person to whom things happened. The reason is that it's so difficult to describe any human being, so they say this is what happened, but they do not say what the person was like to whom it happened, end quote. In my case, I could not tell you who this little boy was because I had only the dimmest idea. I would at odd moments of danger lurch from my dreamy cocoon to ask, where am I? Not who am I? Though the I at the end of the where question would throb accusingly. In retrospect, I can see that I was a quiet, obliging, bland, ruminative, not very interesting boy. Many stories were related to me by others about this boy, but these are not, properly speaking, my memories. For instance, I was told that my sister, a year younger than I, though much more alert, used to poke me for attention while I lay nearby, staring at the ceiling, until one day I hauled off and smacked her, only to return immediately to my placid daydream. From the start, it seems, I needed a good deal of interior space from which to assemble a social persona, and that has remained regrettably true to this day. I was told that I was beautiful, which is not true to this day, and with my dark brown eyes and long eyelashes and dimpled smile, I looked like the Christ child. Certain Roman Catholic women who came into my parents' candy store would cross themselves when they saw me. I was like the Bambino in the Virgin and Child paintings. From thence may derive my lifelong passive acceptance of other people's adoration. I sensed myself to be royalty. There was considerable clamor at the time about the recent coronation of Queen Elizabeth, and since her consort, Prince Phillip, and I shared the same first name, it seemed likely I was also of the purple. The other eminence I had been compared to was the Prince of Darkness of our Brooklyn Jewish neighborhood, Adolf himself. My older brother Lenny used to tease me by placing his finger across my upper lip and saying, I look like Hitler. I accepted this association, too, as a sad kind of tribute. Whether my lineage descended from Jesus, Prince Philip, the Fuhrer, or some combination, clearly I felt myself to be a distinguished foundling and not related to the squabbling, tenement-living, working-class bunch who claimed they were my family. Albert Einstein did not speak until he was 4, nor read till 7. In these ways, and who knows what others, I resemble Professor Einstein. I, too, rarely spoke during the first years of my life, and only began reading when I was 7 or even a little later. It was said of some author, I forget whom, that he did not speak until he was 6, when he uttered his first words, a complaint that the roast beef was overcooked. Asked why he had not spoken before, he replied, until now everything was all right. I have long been under the impression this anecdote referred to Thomas Babington Macaulay, only to discover on researching him, I hate to use the word Google as a verb, that Macaulay read everything in sight from age 2 and babbled profusely and abstrusely to all who would listen. I conclude that as a child I was more an Einstein than a Macaulay. Perhaps I too was contented and thought nothing wrong with the world until I reached the age of 6. Part 2. Black sheep. My parents were the black sheep of their respective middle-class families in that they made no money. Both were working parents, not stay-at-homes, of necessity. My father had been a newspaper reporter with an obscure ambition to write poetry before the papers that employed him folded in the Depression and he went to work in a ribbon dyeing factory and later as a clerk in the garment industry. My mother followed a similar path: beauty parlor, radio parks factory, and clerk in the garment industry. I have always warmed to the 19th century literature of clerks: Gogol's The Overcoat, Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener, Charles Lamb's Ilya essays. Those are my people. Both my parents, as I say, were downwardly mobile, and their only pride was that they were more cultured than their prosperous siblings. My father read books, and my mother listened to classical music. We regarded our well-off relatives as materialistic bores. I remember when my brother Lenny, then in his teens, studying to be a painter, was accosted by our cousin Lawrence at a family get-together and asked what he would do if he came into possession of a Rembrandt. My brother said, "Well, I'd hang it on the wall and look at it." My cousin replied, true to form, "Me, I'd sell it in a minute." Actually, that cousin was quite clever and went on to devise a medical information system for the internet. Nor do I think any longer that his answer was so crass or unreasonable. I might sell it myself. But growing up, we saw ourselves as one side of the class and cultural divide, our relatives on the other. My mother had come from an exceedingly large family. She was the youngest, and her parents had died when she was only 10. She was then handed around from one older sister to another and never forgave her siblings for their reluctant parenting. But she had a soft spot for one of her older brothers, George, the architect, and sent me off to him one summer for some polishing and a chance to get away from the sweltering streets. Williamsburg, Brooklyn was not the swanky area it has become, but a run-down Jewish shtetl which many adults were desperate to escape. We kids, however, knowing no other life, liked it well enough. I prowled it hungrily like a dog sniffing, fascinated by the lox and pickles odors from the appetizer store on Lee Avenue, the knish stands, the onion, rye, and bialys in the bakery. Uncle George lived in Brookline, Massachusetts, a well-ordered suburb of Boston, in a large Art Deco apartment house. He resembled in physical appearance the actor Ed Wynn of Wizard of Oz fame, but he was less benign. He imagined himself a wit, and liked telling children wittily to go play in traffic. He had recently had some heart problems, so I was instructed to go easy on him, not to expect much attention. I arrived in the midst of my cousin Betty Ann's gift shower and impending wedding. Betty Ann was a genuine beauty, leggy and full-bosomed, and I suppose it is fair to say, a genuine Jap, the first I had ever encountered. I watched in anthropological fascination as she and her mother unwrapped the presents at the breakfast table the morning after her shower and commented sarcastically about this one's cheapness and that one's bad taste. My aunt paid little attention to me except to correct my table manners, and as this instruction made me feel like a poor relation, I was happier to be neglected. I spent most of my time across the street playing with a neighbor boy named Joel who lived in a house with a big backyard. I am surprised in retrospect that I so easily befriended this boy, about whom I remember nothing except that he was most serviceable. I also remember my Uncle George extending himself once by taking me to Fenway Park for a Red Sox game. I got a chance to see the great Ted Williams, near retirement, pinch hit a home run. That was memorable, the stand's communal feeling of love and awe for this reserved demigod. My only other vivid memory from the summer in Brookline was the wedding. The catering hall went on from room after room. The array of food was spectacular, but after 15 minutes I was lost amidst masses of strange people taller than myself and could think of nothing else to do except keep moving about, looking as though I had a purpose. Finally, one of the adults asked if I wanted to go for a drive to get an ice cream somewhere. If this happened today, we would think he was a potential child molester and fear for the boy. But in fact, the man was simply a good human being who saw a child estranged from his surroundings and took pity on the kid. Perhaps he too was bored with the wedding reception and wanted an excuse to get away. In any case, he asked me questions about myself, and I found myself overflowing with precociously intelligent chatter, playing to the hilt the sensitive youngster and eliciting his approval. Sensitive souls recognize each other across generational lines, or so it availed me to think at the time. Those rare occasions when adults took me seriously and wanted to know what I thought, how I cherished them, and how they speeded up the process of self-creation. 3. the last part. The boys of my youth, with apologies to Joanne Beard. Speak, memory. Yes, Nabokov, I know. Happy or sad, it almost doesn't matter. Sometimes when I am on a train, not a subway, but an actual leisurely Amtrak, chugging between cities, I will suddenly hark back to a summer decades ago and proceed to watch it like a movie. Or lying in bed in the morning, I summon up my friends from public school, all boys, unthinkable in those days for me, and not just me, to have a friend who was a girl. There was David Weiss, a well-behaved, well-liked kid with a precise part in his hair, whose stay-at-home mother would greet us with milk and chocolate cake when I accompanied him home from school. That was my notion of heaven, a stay-at-home mom with chocolate cake at the ready. I would play up to her, offering to take out the trash, and she would turn to David and say, "Now why can't you be more like your friend Phillip?" It was a tribute to David's gentleness that he did not punch me in the eye. There was Gerald Levy, a quiet genius whose family owned a brownstone in Williamsburg, and whose father and grandfather were both doctors. The grandfather, retired, listened to classical music all day. The house was rigged with an intercom system. All my friends at the time, I see now, came from respectable, professional, middle-class families, and my visits to their homes offered eye-opening revelations of the potential for comfort and sanity. I never once invited them to my own disordered home, a pigsty in comparison. There was Arthur Fankuchen, the smartest kid in our class, I was always number 2, who was reluctant to play board games with me, saying, "I know you'll get upset if you lose." He was right. How did he know that? But I insisted each time that I wouldn't. The Fankuchens had a black maid who provided us with delicious chocolate cake. The father was a scientist, and the mother had some sort of muscular illness like multiple sclerosis, forcing one arm to dangle helplessly at her side. I obnoxiously commented to her, without thinking, that I thought almost all diseases were psychosomatic. It was a word much bandied about in my Freudian household. And there was Elliot Seligman. His mother was a school teacher and his father a pharmacist. They lived in a swanky apartment house with marble lobby a few blocks away from our slummy digs. Elliot, though bright enough in class, liked above all to laugh and have fun. He invited me one summer to his country house on Lake Mayapec. We rowed across the lake one day, discussing the girls in our class. Then the weather turned stormy, and we just about made it back to shore. I admired Elliot's gift for happiness until one September when he returned from his summer camp adventures and bragged that he had become a smooth make-out artist, which I, in my violent envy, decided made him insufferably shallow. Among my Christian friends there was Matthew Mattoon, a thoughtful and loyal companion, short with a bristly blonde crew cut, who used to walk home with me from school every day. His parents were graphic artists, bohemians. They had the first exposed brick wall I ever saw. I pretended to them that I had read Camus. I think I dumped Matthew when he was not promoted to the rapid advanced class in high school, or else we simply drifted apart without second thoughts, as often happened with these firefly childhood friendships. I liked to play punch ball in the schoolyard after the school day ended, and hung around a boy named Robert Malinuk, who could send a ball over the fence for a home run with a patient flick of his wrists. Malinuk, who was Polish-American Catholic, had a calm, clean-cut, steady, pleasant demeanor, not a trace of neuroticism about him. He lived in Greenpoint, a largely Polish neighborhood near Williamsburg. One day, I went over to his house after school and met his mother. On the kitchen wall was an icon-like picture of the Madonna, a crucifix, and a large, round, "I Like Ike" campaign button with a smiling Dwight David Eisenhower. I got spooked, like being in the enemy camp. More some from that smiling Ike than the religious imagery. My parents, New Deal, Adlai Stevenson Democrats, had spoken disparagingly about Eisenhower as a nincompoop, almost mentally challenged. I don't think I ever met a bona fide Republican before Mrs. Malinuk, except for my sixth grade teacher, Mrs. Gelston, who would periodically rail against FDR's betrayals, which was simply too weird to take seriously. I remember asking Mrs. Malinuk if she didn't think Ike was kind of dumb. I was never invited back to the Malinuk home again. But I continued to be fascinated by these calm, neatly turned out Christian boys whose quiet self-confidence seemed to issue from being members of the majority, a Brooklyn noblesse oblige, or so I attributed it at the time. There was Kenneth Pukel, another Polish boy, who kept his pens and compass and protractor in a scrupulously organized pencil case and whose nape of neck hair was always perfectly trimmed. All the girls had a crush on blonde, polite Kenneth. There was his equally popular best friend, William, who lived in a brownstone in Fort Greene and whose father played classical clarinet. Behind each of these boys was a mother, I suspected, who made sure, unlike mine, every hair was in place before they left the house. Neither of these boys had any real affection for me, but they tolerated my presence and were courteous. That was the new thing I aspired to learn from them. Courtesy, a Christian virtue, I imagine, like the Knights of the Crusades, so different from the loud, harsh, argumentative timbre of my own family. Envying Kenneth's and Willie's cool aplomb, I wanted badly to condescend to them, to despise them for my intellectual heights. But they both did well at schoolwork, and their handwriting was impeccably neat. They faced academic challenges temperately, without needing to boast, the way I and my siblings did. I thought that they contained the secret of being an American, and wondered if I would ever feel properly American myself. I still wonder. By the way, I've changed my mind about Eisenhower over the years. Did you know he almost ran on the Democratic ticket? He was a moderate Republican of the kind that regrettably is almost extinct, and he left the White House presciently warning about the military-industrial complex. According to my researchers, Googling again, Elliot is now a clinical psychologist, Gerald and Robert are physicians, Matthew, Kenneth, and Willie seem to have disappeared, Arthur went to Harvard and he became a composer of the new music, and David has had a distinguished career as a health services administrator. If any of this is wrong, guys, please don't write in to correct me, much less sue me. What counts is not so much what became of you as that you were stalwart friends when I needed you. You helped by example to achieve my lifelong goal, which was to climb into the middle class. Am I really a class traitor? Certainly I felt little inclination to cling to the values, much less the paycheck, of the working class or lower middle class, whichever category my parents might have been slotted into. I could never be sure. On the other hand, since my parents themselves were refugees from the bourgeoisie, who could not help but infect us with a bourgeois mindset, perhaps I was being loyal to them after all. Thomas Carlyle wrote, "Why is the past so beautiful? The element of fear is withdrawn from it, for one thing. That is all safe, while the present and future are all so dangerous." Unquote. Can it be as simple as that? The absence of fear is surely important, yet it is only one of the past's attractions. Gertrude Stein said something like, I can't be bothered to look up the exact wording, but something like, the things we do that most embarrass us in our youth, we later come to think of as our charms. We are charmed by our younger selves, or at least more accepting of the gaffes he or she once made, compared to the disgust that our current blunders inspire. This is not to say that I have no regrets about my past conduct. I still cringe at the callous comment I made to Arthur's mother, and I would do much to undo my fickleness toward Matthew. But the one who made those errors was so inchoate, such a stripling, a calf, a tadpole, that he can scarce be held responsible for them, and by virtue of the forgiveness of memory, neither can I. I'm going to read one more piece, and then a short piece, and then I'll take questions. This is called The Enigma of Literary Reward. There is nothing more becoming in an author than modesty. Regardless of what egotistical airs they may put on, most writers, I suspect, have a fairly accurate assessment of their own worth and achievement. Still we, are dependent to an uncomfortable extent on the world's judgment, perhaps hoping that by some fluke the world will rate us higher than we can rate ourselves. The problem is not that the world so often ignores literary effort, though that is certainly the case, but that to the degree it breaks its silence, it tends to distribute the rewards in a mystifyingly erratic manner. There seems to be no logical pattern discernible in the honors, fellowships, and glowing reviews it bestows or does not bestow on writers who have achieved a respectable level of professionalism. Why should writer X get so much attention when the equally accomplished writer Y gets next to none? Writer Z must try to make sense of the clashing kudos and snubs she has received, the flatteries and cold rejections, when underneath it all lies the suspicion that there is no sense to be made. Of course, there are those rare American authors who, once placed in the limelight, manage to stay there, let's say 100 in any given era. I can't speak for those anointed ones, those household names, those demigods. My experience is rather in the other camp, with the thousands of middle-list writers whom the reading public may be dimly, subliminally aware of or not. Much teeth-gnashing, cursing, and praying can be heard from this camp. Its occupants have not yet given up the dream of ascending to the Club of 100 through some breakthrough book, splashy advertising campaign, or other fata morgana, and what keeps them in a state of constant suspense is that from time to time a bone is tossed to them, a flattering review, say, a runner-up designation for literary reward, or best of all, a university post. If the world were to deny them any recognition, they could at last resign themselves stoically, if not cheerfully, to their non-entity status. But it is the inconsistent application of applause and indifference that makes their situation tormenting and drives them into lesser or greater fits of paranoia. How are we to keep a firm grip on our sense of worth when the authorities dish out such random responses? How are we to stop obsessing about them, the reward givers? You have never won a Guggenheim Fellowship and you fume. Those cowards, those bozos. Then one day you do win a Guggenheim and think, they are mighty fine fellows, those judges. And are happy for a month before other thoughts settle in. Why, if you are a good enough writer to win a Guggenheim, have you never won a Lanning or a Whiting, much less a MacArthur? Those cowards, those bozos. You are admitted to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, but never hear a peep from the Academy of American Letters. What to make of it? An enigma. You receive fine notices in the New York Times Book Review and the Cleveland Plain Dealer, but nothing in the Wall Street Journal or Book Forum. Why? It is not the negative reviews that rankle, but the non-reviews. There is a picture in my mind of some book review editor who holds my latest book in his hands and decides, nah, skip it. Some of these people I run into at holiday parties and literary events. How can these traitors look me in the eye? How can they sleep at night, those cowards, those bozos? Such is the fruitless, hamster-like mental scratching that greets me when I wake in the morning or while waiting for the subway train. Just about now I can hear the angry snorts from writers who are still struggling to break into the big leagues. How dare this guy who has gotten a fair amount of recognition compared to us whine about not having had enough? I sympathize completely with their disgust, but in truth, it is never enough. Imagine the pangs Phillip must feel each time the Nobel Prize in Literature is announced. The world's refusal to honor you in a consistent manner cannot help but be taken personally, and the resulting fever requires extraordinary maturity to temper. With so much war, poverty, injustice, and environmental degradation afoot, aren't I ashamed to be worrying about my literary status? Yes and no. Chagrin is an illness. I try to master it. I put myself on an envy-free diet and limit the number of minutes I will allow myself to brood after discovering that so-and-so, one of my contemporaries, has just won a major award. As soon as I find myself thinking, I may not be such a great writer, but he or she is no better than I am, I switch mental currents into another equally absorbing topic, such as the demise of the Knicks in the playoffs. Or I count my blessings. Regrettably, I have never been very good at counting my blessings. I am much better at counseling sane resignation to my writer friends in the grip of fury at a literary snub. I tell them that even to call it a snub is a stretch, as it implies willful neglect when there may be nothing more here than the long odds against public acclaim or the imbalance between our human capacity to generate desires and our ability to satisfy them. A friend of mine, a terrific poet, is convinced there is a conspiracy excluding him from certain rewards and publications. Surveying the field, he calculates the present advantages of race, religion, gender, generation, genre, the lamentably low aesthetic standards of the current cultural moment, and the charlatans who act as our literary gatekeepers. I consider him, like most of the paranoia inclined, an optimist. If only it were that simple. If only we could lay the blame on a sinister group of fashion-conscious power brokers, those cowards, those bozos, who get together every first Monday of the month at, say, the Century Club to determine the season's winners and losers. No, I am a pessimist in such matters. I see nothing but randomness, pure randomness. Fortunately, the solution to such a painful dilemma is always close by. I am referring to a sense of perspective. We are all soon to be dust and ashes under the aspect of eternity. A comfortingly modest thought. There is nothing, I repeat, in an author more becoming than modest. I myself am, when all is said and done, exquisitely modest. I recognize my talent as a small one, and it has taken me further than I ever imagined when I started out in adolescence on the writing path. So I will conclude by expressing my abject gratitude to the powers that be for recognizing me to the degree they have seen fit. We will leave it at that. Thank you. And I will take comments, questions if there are any. Yes.
I remember reading an article you wrote about writing memoirs and
Yeah.
how the narrator needs to be present on like the first page.
Yes.
How, I don't know, do you have any thoughts on balancing the presence of the current narrator?
Well, what I said was that the narrator has to be intelligent on the first page. You can't stage the development of your consciousness so that on page 1 you're kind of clueless, and then on page 200 it all comes together. You have to kind of, readers don't want to, be at the mercy of someone so confused and clueless. They want to see that you do have an awareness, even though then you didn't. Yeah.
So a sense of the intelligence of the narrator is enough. You don't have to explicitly like foreshadow or let the reader in on the ending or something.
No, you don't have to let the reader in the ending, especially if it's a memoir and autobiography. You don't know what the ending is. That's the one last chapter that can never be written. No, but seriously, I think that you eventually you draw a portrait of yourself as a character. But I do think that what's so useful is to develop a fluent, intelligent, full voice, witty, ironic narrator at the beginning that can draw people in, and get them a sense of the cultural level that the piece is going to be written at. Other questions? Yes.
So you mentioned in your first essay how you had, when you were young, you had aspirations of being a well-known fiction writer. You
Yes.
mentioned at another point that there was a time where you were writing a lot of poetry. I guess I'm just curious, and now it seems like you're mostly focused on essays.
Yes.
So I'm just curious if your path is taking you in any other directions, or just how you ended up where you are.
Well, it did take me a while to get to the essay, but I continue to write. A few years ago, I published a collection of novellas called Two Marriages. So I think every 10 years I'm going to write some fiction, But I think what happened was that I began trying to be a fiction writer, and then my life got very hectic, and I began to write poetry. And of course, the advantage is you can't actually knock off a poem in one sitting, whereas you can't knock off a short story often, or a novel certainly. And also, I had a lot of friends who were poets, and I thought, well, let me see if I can do this stuff. So I was really going between fiction and poetry when I fell in love with the essay, which seemed to me could combine the storytelling of fiction with the kind of associational consciousness of the poem. So I found it could do both in a way. And also, I got recognition for doing it, which was very reinforcing, you know. And I got anti-recognition from friends who are fiction writers and poets. They would say, "You really should write essays, Lopate. You know, like, do that. Don't do what we're doing. You know." Anyway, so I've also written screenplays and plays. So, but I mean, I used to be, you know, there used to be this phrase, a man of letters. Now it's a person of letters. But you should really try everything. And certainly I think if you're writing prose, it's very helpful to write poetry at some point, you know, just to get a sense of the economy of language. I do believe that's all we have time for. Thank you for being a good audience.